Hello, Changemaker,
Welcome to the Innovation Room.
a place for business leaders,
Change agents and change champions.
anyone who wants to know where digital transformation is taking us,
A place that sparks ideas.
and explores what's really possible with software and technology.
Ready?
Let's see what's happening.
Welcome to the Innovation Room. I'm Kate Fletcher, CEO Mentor, Coach and Catalyst, and I'm on the Geeks Advisory Board. I'm delighted to be hosting 3 podcasts for International Women's Day and as part of the Digital is from Venus series. My guest of today's podcast, Release the Shearer, is the most successful hockey coach of all time in GB. He is highly recognised and has been coach of GB hockey for over 17 years. Over his long tenure at the top of the game, he has learnt how to unlock the potential in the best female talent alongside the best male talent. And he understands better than anyone what differences exist and how we must adapt our leadership to deliver the highest performance. Please join me in the Innovation Room with Danny Kerry, gold medal winning Olympic coach of GB women's hockey team in Rio, amongst many other awards, medals and accolades. Can I ask you first of all to introduce yourself?
So my name is Danny Kerry. For 17 years, I was essentially the national coach of the Great Britain and England hockey teams, so through 4 Olympic cycles. And when I wasn't doing that, I'm a sort of a husband and a dad to 2 daughters. So it's been a pretty hectic 17 years, and I resigned last January, and I'm just sort of finding my feet as to what next.
The outstanding moment for me was obviously at Rio, watching you guys win the gold medal, and being a hockey player, I was hugely passionate about that.
Yes, understandably, everyone really remembers Rio. For me, the home Olympics in 2012 and us medaling there. So the first time Team GB as a whole collective, actually won a team sport medal in over 20 years, and sort of the pioneers within that team that then set up subsequent success.
Well, to many people, you've been the most successful coach in the history of hockey in this country, right? So, and an MBE to recognise that as well. So brilliant that you're able to share some of what you've learned over that time with us. Before we dive into it anymore, I mustn't forget to ask you, who would you bring into the Innovation Room with you and why?
As a postgraduate student, I actually studied sociology and politics. I was very interested in something known as hegemonic theory. That's
Okay.
very dull, but essentially there was an Italian, essentially sociologist, economist known as Antonio Gramsci, and he was actually imprisoned for some of his views, and he wrote this series of books called the Prison Notebooks. Basically, he was looking at how those without power consent to be dominated by those with power. And so this hegemonic theory was sort of a development of Marxist theory. And having read a lot of that material, I can't help just constantly seeing the world in that light. And the sort of the way that the world is structured in such a way that we sort of consent to the different power structures within society. So I think spending an evening with him, although he's long deceased, that would be quite interesting. As how he even came to see the world in that way.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Fascinating. Deeply philosophical. I know.
Yeah, it's probably not the kind of thing at 9:30 on a cold Tuesday morning.
Can I take you back to Beijing, perhaps, as a starting point? I know that was a couple of years in for you, but talk to us about what you experienced there and how that felt.
Yeah. So I imagine very classically, I was appointed in 2005, and I was really just appointed on the background of sort of technical and tactical expertise in hockey. I had relatively low level of experience leading others. So ended up in a genuine leadership position through sort of technical expertise, and then limited skills and experience in actually leading people. 2.5 years, 3 years later, we go to Beijing, and what should have been the absolute highlight in those athletes' lives, going to Olympic Games. I mean, it was quite something for us to qualify for Beijing, but having got there, essentially the way that I led, or my lack of leadership, I should say, made that experience for some of those athletes, not the experience it should have been. And that ultimately was sort of my lack of experience and ability to lead others well. So that was, I received that feedback pretty starkly and pretty clearly. And no one ever.
How did that happen, Danny? So, I mean, you make a really interesting point and a really common experience, I think, for people in business around, people that reach a leadership position based on technical expertise and then are sort of thrown into the deep end and then learn through often very painful experience. So please share yours with us and how that manifested itself.
Yeah, so I mean, even before I got back from Beijing, I sensed that I'd lost a good percentage of the group, not all of them, but a good percentage of the group. And you can tell that just through body language and interactions. And I'm relatively introverted. I'm not the most outgoing person, not the most social person. That doesn't mean I'm not capable of that. It's just not my, my natural way of being. So, I could tell I'd lost people. That was already starting to sort of really nag at me, like, okay, I've stuffed up here. But when I got back to the UK, the Team GB and Olympic programs are very, very good at doing sort of thorough reviews, and I received sort of verbatim transcripts of what people had written about the way I'd made people feel, and yeah, it was pretty stark. Not for everybody, but for enough. And I'm very fortunate in the way I responded to that. I wasn't sort of in denial and anger about it. I was like, okay, yeah, I've really let some people down there, and I was really adamant to try and do a better job. And fortunately, I think because I responded in that way, classically when we receive feedback that we perceive as sort of attacking of our sense of self, we can be in sort of denial and anger about it. I think because I didn't respond in that way, and I was much more, okay, I understand that, and I understand I've not done as well as I might, I was allowed to continue. So the chairman of the board and the performance director supported me. They'd appointed a young head coach, and okay, as long as you learn your lessons and you sort of look to do a better job, then we'll continue to support you. And then I was adamant from that point onwards, and we had a home Olympics to look forward to, 4 years later. So that then sort of springboarded me into trying to do my job a lot better.
And what helped you most with that transition? Because I guess, there's one thing knowing what you don't know, and then there's a whole different ball game in how you build that capability.
I was very fortunate. There were some really good mature athletes within the program. And so when we restarted, I actually shared some of the feedback that I received back to the athletes saying, you have said this about me, and I apologize to that around that. I also shared some of my psychometric profile with the athlete group to allow them to understand where I'm coming from. So some of their assumptions about my introversion was that I was grumpy and unapproachable. The reality was I just live inside my head and think things through a lot. Yes. And that can be perceived as being sort of standoffish. And that's just not me at all. If people engage, I will engage back. It's just, and I have to use energy to go and reach out to people, and I've learned to do that. But under pressure, sometimes I revert to type and go inward. So I shared those things. I apologized and spoke to the elephant in the room, spoke to the feedback. And then really the thing that I think we did really, really well was then we developed a really quick iterative process within the program. So every 3 weeks I was asking for sort of feedback about the program, and by default feedback about myself. And so that generated both ownership of the program by the athletes, but it also allowed me to kind of constantly sort of take the temperature of how the group were feeling, whether they were feeling invested in it and respected the way that it was being led and driven. Yes. But that was sort of my evolution of my my leadership journey. I think the formal piece of some of the psychometric profile and the self-awareness raising was really, really good. I always say it was in combination with the feedback that I got from Beijing, plus having some mature athletes who then part their judgment and move from judgment to understanding was really quite key to the development, rather than staying in that judgmental place, and had actually understood my intentions were really good. They were really well formed. My intentions were to try and help, and some of the assumptions of my leadership behavior, they then parked and allowed me to be the coach that I was, probably critically.
How easy was it for you to bring those experienced athletes with you on that journey?
Like any walk of life, you've got the whole standard deviation curve of different types of people. So being sort of very open and talking to, this is what I've heard, and apologizing to that, and trying to reestablish trust. For some that was a relatively straightforward process. For others, once you've broken that trust, that's really hard to get back. So there may be respect about what you're trying to do, but maybe there's always that little piece of, mistrust, and trying to reestablish, fully was always a long-standing challenge.
In the innovation room, a lot of innovation comes out of vision. If I can take you back to when you took the job and you stood looking ahead at what you wanted to accomplish in hockey, what was your vision? How would you articulate it?
Well, if you're the national coach of Great Britain going to Olympic Games, I think you're doing a disservice to the athletes if you're not striving to sort of take your team as far as it can go. And there's a large number of hockey players in the UK, relatively small compared to the big sports, but still a large number. And I felt quite strongly that we were kind of still doing what we'd always done and just trying to improve that, rather than there being a step change. So as early as 2007, I was having floating ideas past the athlete group around, we need a step change. If we're going to stop bouncing around between 12 and 8, 12 and 6 in the world, and we want to move onwards to genuine podium performance, we need a step change. And really, podium was my vision, and it was also something aspirational that all of the athletes shared. But I think the gap was, well, we can't just try to keep doing what we're always doing and just improving it by the odd percent here. It needs a step change. And my vision was really around centralizing the program and asking a lot of the athletes to become full-time, to train full-time, and to centralize around Bisham Abbey area. And that in effect was the vision that drove the bigger vision.
So as you reflect back, having achieved, well, more than just a podium, right? As you reflect back on those achievements and you think about that vision, what would be the sort of 2 or 3 biggest ingredients of that success, would you say?
I think we did a really remarkable job, and there were some key other staff involved with that. So, Sally Mundy, who's now the Chief Executive of UK Sport, Emma Mitchell, who was our performance lifestyle lead. I think between the three of us, but those two playing quite a key role, we did a really good, I think in the business world, you call it change management. Yes. So we were sort of floated this idea of centralizing the program and asking people to give up their jobs and their study to train full time for very, very little money. I think what we did well was engage them about what their fears were around that, but also what their hopes were. We also engaged really well around what the transition could look like and should look like to support them through that journey. And then fundamentally, they were in from day one. The athletes were in from day one about designing how the program could run that would allow them to support sort of both their Olympic playing careers and their future careers once their hockey was over. And I think those conditions at the very start created buy-in, created ownership and agency within the group. So I think we did that really, really well. And then I think between 2009 all the way up to sort of Rio, I think that we kept some of those really good processes going. So involving the athletes in feeling a genuine investment and ownership of the program, and ensuring that they knew they were supported on many levels. So not just from a performance perspective, but also in terms of their wider holistic development. So I think they're the key ingredients. I'd probably add latterly that we were fortunate in that 2012 created its own laser-like focus, right? So, going to Olympics is massive. Hosting a home Olympics is just a whole different order. So that created a laser-like focus. And then having medalled there for the first time in 20 years, it then created a sense of actually what we're doing is working. So you sort of let's keep going, let's keep refining and keep going, and then the rest is history.
Can we talk about the ownership piece? I think I'm really fascinated by that. It's a topic. So I mentor and coach CEOs. One of the biggest topics that's prevalent right now is around ownership and accountability. And I'm really interested in understanding how you built that sense of ownership, because it's a sort of, on one hand, it's an easy thing to say. It's a very, very difficult thing to really do. And particularly in your instance, where you're asking people to train full time and make some quite considerable sacrifices in their lives. So how did you successfully do that?
There were many people involved, so I don't want to sit here and take all the credit. But I think fundamentally, the frequency of review and the clarity of that review. So there are only 2 questions were asked every 3 weeks, and that was, did we live our performance culture? A little Likert scale 1 to 4. So you couldn't sit on the fence. You were either giving a negative score or a positive score. And then they had to provide some qualitative text to go with their score. And then, was our training effective? Was actually what we were doing on the pitch effective? 1 to 4 and some qualitative text. So those 2 very, very focused questions, the Likert scale, the qualitative text, every 3 weeks, then was just simply accumulated, given back to the squad. They went through it and identified the things that were going well and we could leverage more, and also identified the things that we needed to evolve and iterate. And as a result of that, people, genuinely felt that the way that the program was running was their ideas. So they're invested in that process. And I think that's the thing that really underpinned genuine ownership of what we were trying to do, and critically how we were trying to do it. And that's the bit that I think often gets missed. It's not just agreeing like, what are we going after with absolute laser-like focus, but how. Yes. And the last bit I would add to that, Kate, is I think in any type of performance culture, business culture, any kind of culture, there's sort of tends to be 3 things going on. There tends to be some sense of agreement around what we're going after, but at the same time there can be some and how. But there also means the second thing was a little bit of ambiguity around that. So, it's the most stupid things. So like when we had team gym sessions, so not on the pitch, but in the gym, do they wear the Adidas Great Britain kit now, or can they wear their own gym kit? And it sounds daft, but, over X hundreds of sessions, over X period of months and years, those little things, where there's ambiguity, can lead to potentially to the third thing, which is conflict.
Yes.
And those 3 things always exist. There's some sense of agreement, there's some sense of ambiguity, and then there can be, and there is, conflict. But that 3-week iteration addressed those things constantly.
You talk about how, and it's one of my key phrases that I use a lot with clients. But it's quite easy to say the what, and what are we trying to do? Actually doing it is a whole different ball game.
Yeah.
For me, this leans into a little bit that perhaps the differences, the gender differences, and I'm really keen to understand, because you were a coach of guys primarily before you took over the women's team, and I'm really interested in what you learnt around how you lead talented women and how different that was from leading talented men, and the different needs and the different challenges.
I think it's really important, Kate, that at this point I sort of caveat, if you were to take 100 high-performing women, and you're in that standard deviation, in that bell curve, you're going to find there's much differentiation about what people needs and wants. Going to have huge differentiation. The same for men, all right? Yes. But if you're asking those, like in my case, 30 high-performing women to come together and work as a team, and then compare them to 30 high-performing men to come together as a team, they feel, well, in my experience, and it's years, they are materially different things.
Yes.
And I'm going to oversimplify this hugely, and I think I heard someone else mention this, and it really resonates with me. It's like for women, you need to work for them to bond, and then they'll go to battle, right? So work hard on them understanding one another, understanding why we're doing what we're doing, how we're going to do it, work hard on building the relationships, and then they will battle tooth and nail for one another. They will run through brick walls for one another. But if you don't do that and you ask them to go to battle, it's just not going to work. With blokes, it's entirely the other way around. They're not going to bond until they've been to battle together. So actually put them through some kind of shared hardship, and they will now bond.
Yes.
With women, the other way around. Do the bonding, and then they will go through brick walls. Now, that is a very simplistic way of looking at it, but in my experience, it summarizes it pretty well. For me, the women's team, I think their absolute strength was they were very curious around why, and they wanted to know why. Why are we doing this? Show us the plan. If they understood the plan and felt invested in the plan, they would be absolutely 100% committed. If they didn't understand the plan and they filled that vacuum with their own thoughts and opinions and feelings and didn't really understand why, and dysfunctional assumptions, then you had problems. But if they understood the plan, there's clarity of why we're doing what we're doing, and they're invested in that, brilliant. The blokes, not interested in the why, just tell us what to do.
Okay.
And again, that's overly simplified, but essentially, just don't worry about that. Tell us what to do and we'll get on and do. For me, there's an aspect of absolving yourself of responsibility there. So if the plan doesn't work, well, you told us what to do. So now it hasn't worked, so you carry the responsibility of it. So so for me, high-performing team, female, women's teams, and their understanding and investment in what we're doing, how we're doing it, and why we're doing it. If that's well established, you're on a good ground. I'm really aware, Kate, that there's some sweeping generalizations in there, but
well, I'm asking you some very broad questions, so
that is some pretty hard-won experience there.
Yeah, well, and you referenced some of the Beijing experience. I suppose much of that must have come through that feedback for you.
Yeah, and just constant conversations with the women's team in particular has really wanted to have the certainty of knowing the plan and what sits behind the plan, and then their ability to feed into that plan.
Yes.
Whereas when I went and worked in the men's Olympic program, it was like, no, you're the head coach for a reason, right? You just tell us what to do. And that is slightly oversimplifying a bit, but that's my sense.
Going back to the scenario which she had with the women, obviously, and a phrase that's used a lot today, but psychological safety obviously is very important in order to encourage people to be curious and to ask questions and to give you feedback. How did you go about, and what were some of the themes, I suppose, in building that psychological safety?
I think in asking people every 3 weeks for feedback, and so in effect, as a leader, you're asking for feedback on the way the program is operating, and you are seen as largely responsible for that. And then people seeing change on that feedback, that makes people understand that you're genuine, you want the feedback, right, and you're going to act on it. So that's the first thing. I think you're quite right. I think it's a term that's sort of used a great deal at the moment. I think there needs to be a little bit of calibration around how it's used and why we're using it. So I think we got to a position with the women where people started to own their feedback. And what I mean by that is their names would go by their feedback. And so that develops a level of maturity in people about, well, I have to have a rationale for writing what I've written. I have to provide some concrete evidence to support that. And that's my part of the responsibility in providing feedback. Okay.
Yes.
And I think that marks out people who are really contributing and using feedback for the purposes intended. I think that if you create an environment where you're only ever asking for sort of anonymous feedback, you're potentially unwittingly creating an environment where people don't have to own that feedback. And that may undermine what you're trying to generate, which is a sense of us, not a sense of the boss and everybody else.
Absolutely. That's a really important point. I mean, asking for feedback every 3 weeks, that's a tough gig, right?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't sort of say categorically feedback on Danny, but implicit in that is sort of, did we live our performance culture? So some inward looking about the athletes, but also, as part of that, the athletes be quick to point out when they felt that the staff weren't living that. And equally, the training environment and the quality of the training environment, the second question, that is a genuine reflection of the way that the program is operating and session design, which is definitely feedback around you as the coach.
Yeah, I mean, it's total transparency, isn't it? And as you describe, I guess a real sense of it is collective. It's collective ownership. There isn't anywhere to hide.
Yeah, the interesting bit and the bit I've learned over time is that when iteration is that frequent, people don't understand the scale and the rate of change. So quite often, sometimes I would make the point of let's just stop and look back the last 6 months and see all of the changes we've made in our program, just to raise people's awareness of, okay, the reason we do this every 3 weeks is we get your investment in it and the rate of change. But if you forget to do that bit, people, it's a bit like, plants growing. You don't notice them growing, and so you need to kind of raise people awareness of your feedback is generating a growth in the program.
I'm asking you to put a judgment on this, but if having done the feedback every 3 weeks, have you got a sense of how much more performance you got? If you had to rate it as a percentage, how much better performance did you get out of that cohort by doing that than almost not, to the point around awareness and constant drive for improvement?
Yeah. So I think, massive. It'd be difficult to put a number on it, but it's all of the less overt benefits of that. So, I talked about the growing of maturity in performers and them starting to take responsibility for their own performance rather than looking at others. You're responsible for developing me. Now I'm responsible to support you in your development. It's your responsibility to develop, right? So your ability to create processes that drive some of that growth in people, they become invested in their development, and understand how important is they taking responsibility for their performance and growth. So those things, I think, are exponentially important in the rate of change we had between sort of 2009 and then winning gold in 2016. So we wouldn't have achieved that. We wouldn't have achieved what we achieved without it.
Can I talk about culture with you?
Sure.
So again, just going back to the sort of differences, I suppose I'm really interested to understand the kind of culture that you created, and with the wider team, for the women to absolutely excel. What were some of those aspects that really brought out the very, very best performance in the women that you were coaching?
Fundamentally, you would imagine it's really obvious, like when an athlete joins an Olympic program, what it is they're going after. You'd think there'd be absolute clarity on that. So you ask, if you're literally asking what is the vision, you'd be amazed at the amount of slight differences in that. So for some, it's a gold medal. For some, it's a medal. For some, it's as long as I give my best. So. And actually, in having those conversations, you start to raise people's awareness in others that everyone comes with these different perceptions and assumptions about what it is we're going after. So you have to go through this really important process of absolute laser-like focus. What is it we're going after? And then exactly the same around how. So you'd imagine there'd be some sort of alignment around how, as soon as you start scratching the surface on that. So well, some athletes are like, no, well, no, we don't need we don't need a full day not being at Bisham Abbey. We're trying to train for Olympic gold medal. Like, we don't need a full day away from Bisham Abbey. And some people are absolutely adamant, I need a full day away from Bisham Abbey to recover, re-energize. Again, it's not so much about the final position you get to on how. It's more that the fact that you've unearthed that people have different perspectives and different views, and you've had the conversation. And now people understand where others are coming from, and you can start to resolve some of the ambiguity. Because if you don't, the ambiguity becomes a conflict. So I think we did that really, really well. And then the stuff I've spoken about, which is the sort of the frequency of review every 3 weeks, that was fundamental. My last bit then is around leaders and leadership. We were very keen, or I in particular was very keen to work backwards from what are the needs of performance.
Yes.
So we did a big brainstorming exercise on whiteboards, like, what are the challenges we face between now and Olympic Games? What are the skills from a leadership and followership perspective we're going to need to meet those needs of performance? Does one singular person have all of those qualities? No, not at all, nowhere near. So we're going to need a breadth of people to deliver on those things. Who are those people? And then we essentially created an ability for the athletes to vote for the leadership group, but also created the expectation that everybody and anybody at some point in time can bring their own individual strength and a need for leadership. So we had quite a few leaders within the group without the title of leader. So there was one athlete called Hannah, who was an exceptional leader in her own way, but was not part of the leadership group. We created an environment where I think people knew and understood, this is my opportunity to contribute, to drive, to be part of the program, and I don't need the title of leader. And so it didn't sort of create passive followers, but more engaged followers within the team.
I mean, that's a huge challenge, isn't it, when you're leading a big squad, essentially?
Yeah.
Can we talk about selection process? Because having been a hockey player and not quite at that level, the pain of not being selected is a big one. And how did you handle that with a group of very committed, very talented women?
Yeah. So you have to talk to it. Don't pretend it doesn't exist. Don't pretend that that anxiety around that doesn't exist. Talk to it. And then my big thing was that it isn't just a point in time. It's constantly an ongoing process. So we would have very formal quarterly reviews, individual quarterly reviews with the athletes, and I always felt it was really important at the end of that quarterly review that they knew literally exactly where they stood in relation to a major Olympic selection. So even if we were 2 years out, at the end of their quarterly review, I would say you're currently within the top 16 consideration for the team, or you're 16 to 18, or you're 18 to 20. And then I would talk about what I perceived as the journey was to get to where they wanted to get to, and they would talk about their perception of that. And again, it goes to people's sense of self. That can get quite emotive. My job is to sort of not to try and react to some of that emotion and just stay. It was to acknowledge the emotion and have some empathy for it, but equally saying, this is the performance world. This is the way we see it currently. This is where we see the journey for you to get to where you want to be. And then they would go away and often write their own individual development plan, which we would then sort of check through and work through with them as part of that quarterly review process. But when it actually came to what normal people perceive as selection, so the actual letter and then the meeting, on the whole, when you're talking about 30 plus athletes, they went really, really well. There's always a small number of athletes incredibly bitterly disappointed, and their emotions come to the surface. And then it's just about, providing enough support around them and not taking some of their denial and anger personally, because often it's directed at you as the person seen as responsible for making that decision. And that is tough when people sometimes are just being emotional and angry at you. You've got to sort of ability to part that and understand that that's what they're going through, and that that's tough.
The big theme coming through this for me is around communication and frequency and the transparency, so that there's no surprises all the way through and everyone knows where they stand, everyone knows what's expected of them.
Yeah, and I think in my last role with the men, the bit I got wrong, I had a large staff. I had 14 plus staff, in fact more than that if you count part-time staff, and 30 plus athletes. Then we had the pandemic, and we had really, really good formal structures, so all of the things I've just mentioned. That some of the informality of communication is the bit that I needed to spend more time and energy on. So just, grabbing a informal coffee in a more frequent way, those types of conversations are the bit that I did do, but I needed to have done more. Equally, though, the thing that I'm most proud about, there isn't a single athlete in probably so I was in head coach for 17 years. I would say in the last 13 of those years, 12 of those years, that they couldn't say they didn't know exactly where they stood. They didn't know exactly what their development plan was in relation to that. They might be in denial about that, but demonstrably it was there if they really wanted to see it. And that sounds a straightforward thing to do. It's not. It takes time.
Absolutely. In business, it often gets deprioritized in the cut and thrust of running a business, and then time goes past, and 6, 9, 12 months can go past, and there's not been a development conversation occasionally. So this is really shining a big light on just how important that is, both to men and women. I know we're talking about women in particular, but
with the women's program in particular, so we would ask them to write their own individual development plans, which they would then present at the quarterly review. So and then we would sense check and discuss, and then we would come to agreement on that. And we debated internally as a staff, so does there need to be some scaffolding around it, or can they literally present it in any format they wish, as long as it's getting to the heart of performance? And for a number of years we did it. They could literally present in any way they felt worked well for them. That I really enjoyed, although it doesn't sit well necessarily with major stakeholders who come in and say, well, we want to see all the individual development plans for athletes, and expecting a sort of cookie cutter, this is what it looks like. And then all of a sudden there's sort of some artistry or something that has worked well for that athlete.
Which, as you reflect back on 17 years across the men's and women's game at the highest level, which bit fills you most with joy as you reflect on it?
I guess the moment in time I'm most proud about is actually how we responded to losing the semi-final at the London 2012 Olympics. So we lost to Argentina in a heartbreaking semi late in the evening, and it was an incredible evening. The Olympic Park was amazing. The stadium was absolutely jammed to the rafters, and it was a quite emotional and harrowing game. We lost 2-1. The turnaround 36 hours later to then beating New Zealand in quite dominant style, I think was testimony to the people involved, the way that we'd run that program. So to bring that to life, classically when you've lost a semi-final as a coach, there's this strong sense of, we need to prepare really hard for the bronze medal match. We need to do a really good debrief. We need to do really good preparation for the next game. But because of the way the athletes had worked with me to say this is how we work best, then actually we only had one 15-minute meeting before we played New Zealand, and I didn't speak to the athlete group. We didn't have any meetings with the athlete group for over 24 hours from the loss. We just knew that those individuals needed their own space, their own time, and that they would get themselves right and trust them to get themselves right. And that was probably the bit I'm most proud about them, but also about my ability to just go, okay, got to trust them, let them get on with it. And then just met them briefly before. And that, that journey all the way through the Beijing Olympic cycle, then to the London cycle, then to break through to then medal, those sort of pioneering women, that they're very proud of those people.
On the flip side, if I asked you with the power of hindsight, which is so easy, isn't it? But when we look back and go, right, what one thing would you change if you had the opportunity?
So I led the men's program in the last 2 and a bit years. So from late 2018 through to the 21 games in Tokyo, so the rescheduled games. I think we did an incredible job of rebuilding that squad and bringing in some incredible exceptional talent, and we were tracking really, really well. Like really well. The future is very bright for that men's program. Some exceptional talent in there. The bit that I didn't do well enough and wish I'd done differently, and there's all sorts of variables as to why this happened, but I didn't spend enough time just having informal chats with them. So throw in a pandemic, throw in a huge complexity of planning, throw in a large staff group. Wanted that staff group to feel incredibly empowered, a lot of ownership and agency. So I spent too much time with the staff and not enough time with the athletes. And as a result, a lot of senior players who had previously constantly been selected, and then essentially were starting not to be selected, but still in the squad. You've got a bit of a recipe there for, you've got to look after those people. You've got to build a relationship better than I did. And that's the bit that I regret, because we were on a good trajectory, and I lost some senior players, but you live and learn.
So 17 years down in hockey, many medals and triumphs. What's next for you, Danny? What does the future hold? What would you love to happen?
That's a really good question. I took the view that I would say yes to everything almost for a year after I resigned in January of 2022. So I've dipped my toes into all sorts of different areas. I've worked in the business world with a FTSE 100 company doing some high-performing teamwork, some leadership development, and some executive coaching. So I've done some work around that. Still exploring that a little bit. And then equally, I've done a lot of consultancy with sort of some of the big professional sports. I worked for the England rugby coaching team for a short while. When Eddie Jones was moved on, I was also moved on.
That was unfortunate timing, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah, I was gutted I was moved on. This is going to sound arrogant, but I felt I had still quite a lot to offer in rugby and the coaching, but yeah, there's a different view. So the honest answer is, Kate, I'm kind of looking, and when I see the next opportunity, I think this is the one, then that's where my future lays. But at the moment, that's not quite materialized.
Okay, watch this space. And Danny, if anybody wants to get in touch with you, the opportunity, how should they best do that?
They can find me on LinkedIn, I'm sure. So just Danny Kerry.
Thank you, Danny. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Likewise, thanks.
And exciting to hear. Well, excited to hear where you end up next.
Yeah, let's hope so. I've definitely got to the point where I wake up in the mornings and I miss sort of having that, right, this is what we're going after, and what does that mean today?
Thanks for joining us in the Innovation Room.
We hope it sparks some ideas.
Want to learn more about what we do?
Maybe you could even be our next guest.
And spark some ideas yourself.
Find us at Geeks Limited.
And join us again soon.
Because real change never stops.